Sometimes the truth doesn't show up with proof, it shows up as a feeling. A shift in energy, a strange silence, a look that just feels different. A lot of men brush these moments off because they don't want to come across as paranoid. But deep down, they know when something has changed. 9 signs she may have been with another man recently isn't about fear, it's about awareness. It's about catching what most men miss until it's way too late. Small details, quiet distance, subtle shifts that slowly change the entire connection. And the hardest part, 9 signs she may have been with another man recently often starts showing itself long before the truth becomes obvious. If you're a man who wants sharper awareness, stronger emotional intelligence, and real relationship psychology, hit subscribe now. We're building a community of men who refuse to ignore the signs, and we're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Topic 1. She suddenly becomes emotionally distant. There's a moment in some relationships that doesn't come with a fight, a breakup, or some dramatic confession. It sneaks in quietly. A woman who once felt emotionally close starts feeling just a little farther away, even when she's sitting right next to him. The conversations still happen. The routine stays the same, but underneath it all, something shifts. It's subtle enough to ignore at first, and that's exactly why so many men miss it. Emotional distance rarely makes a loud entrance. It shows up through silence, shorter answers, and a feeling that something just doesn't feel right. A man usually notices this change through small details that are hard to explain to anyone else. She stops asking about his day with real interest. The playful teasing fades away. Eye contact becomes shorter, distracted, almost automatic. It's not always coldness. Sometimes it feels more like she's emotionally checked out, like her mind is somewhere else even while she's physically there. A lot of men tell themselves she's stressed, tired, or dealing with something temporary. And sometimes that's true. But patterns matter more than one random bad day. One of the strongest signs appears when emotional intimacy loses consistency. She may stop sharing personal thoughts, avoid deeper conversations, or react with irritation when he tries to reconnect. A wise man doesn't only listen to what's being said, he notices what quietly disappears. Relationships are built just as much through presence as they are through words. And when presence starts fading, it creates questions that eventually lead to changes in behavior that become harder to ignore. Topic 2. Her routine starts changing without clear explanation. One of the first things a man notices when something feels different isn't always emotion. Sometimes it's rhythm. People are creatures of habit, especially inside relationships. When a woman suddenly changes her schedule, becomes busy at unusual times, or starts creating routines that never existed before, it naturally raises questions. The important thing isn't one late night or a random plan. It's when small changes begin stacking up, quietly building a new pattern that wasn't there before. A wise observer understands that routines reveal priorities. If she used to communicate naturally throughout the day, but now disappears for long stretches without explanation, the difference becomes noticeable. Maybe she suddenly needs more alone time, starts running random errands, or becomes vague about where she's been. On the surface, these things can sound normal, and sometimes they really are. But inconsistency often says more than words ever could. When explanations feel rushed, incomplete, or oddly rehearsed, a man starts feeling like something no longer lines up. The key here isn't paranoia, it's awareness. Strong men don't jump to conclusions. They watch behavior over time. For example, if she suddenly changes gym hours, starts dressing up for simple errands, or becomes unavailable during times that used to be predictable, it leaves unanswered questions. Patterns tell stories long before words do. And once routine changes begin feeling intentional instead of random, another subtle shift often starts showing up, especially when it comes to privacy and digital habits. Topic 3. She becomes overly protective of her phone. Phones have become extensions of people's private worlds. They hold conversations, emotions, secrets, distractions, and connections that usually stay hidden from everyone else. In healthy relationships, there's often an unspoken sense of comfort around technology, a natural transparency where neither person feels the need to hide simple interactions. But when someone suddenly becomes overly protective of their phone, it tends to stand out. not because privacy is wrong, but because behavior changes rarely happen without a reason. A man may notice the little things first. She turns her screen away when messages pop up. Notifications that used to stay visible suddenly disappear. The phone starts lying face down on the table. She carries it everywhere, even into places where it never mattered before. On their own, these behaviors may seem too small to question. But human behavior runs on patterns. And when a familiar rhythm changes without explanation, it creates tension that's hard to ignore. The important thing is not to obsess over one single action, but to look at the bigger picture. For example, if she gets defensive when casually asked who texted her, or quickly locks her screen when someone walks nearby, the reaction may reveal more than the action itself. People tend to protect what they're afraid of exposing. And sometimes, the biggest clue isn't what's hidden, it's how urgently someone tries to keep it hidden. That urgency often starts affecting another area men notice quickly: affection and emotional warmth. Topic 4. Her level of affection changes too much or too little. Affection usually has a natural rhythm when a relationship feels emotionally stable. It shows up through small touches, familiar gestures, shared jokes, and moments that don't need explanation. But when affection suddenly changes, it creates confusion. Some men expect distance to look obvious and cold, but real life isn't always that simple. Sometimes she becomes emotionally unavailable. Other times, she becomes unexpectedly affectionate, almost like she's trying harder than usual. Both extremes can leave a man wondering what changed beneath the surface. A sudden lack of affection is easier to spot. She may stop initiating hugs, avoid physical closeness, or respond to intimacy with less enthusiasm than before. The warmth that once felt effortless begins to feel forced or routine. But what surprises many men is the opposite reaction. In some cases, guilt creates overcompensation. She may become extra attentive, more affectionate, or unusually eager to create connection. Not because everything is better, but because emotional imbalance sometimes hides behind increased effort. Wise men learn to focus on consistency instead of isolated moments. One unusually affectionate week doesn't mean much on its own. What matters is whether her behavior feels genuine or emotionally disconnected. For example, affection may still exist physically, but feel empty emotionally, like someone going through familiar motions without truly being present. The body can imitate closeness while the mind drifts elsewhere. And when affection begins feeling inconsistent, another subtle sign often follows. Communication starts losing its natural openness. Topic 5. She stops sharing small details about her day one. Of the strongest signs of emotional connection isn't found in big romantic gestures, it's found in everyday conversation. People who feel close naturally share small details. What happened at work? A funny interaction. Something annoying that happened during the day. Even random observations that don't really matter. These little stories create familiarity. They connect to lives. And when those details slowly disappear, the silence often means more than people realize. A man may not notice the shift right away because it happens gradually. At first, her answers become shorter. It was fine, nothing really happened, just a normal day. Over time, the richness of conversation fades. She stops volunteering information, avoids elaborating, or redirects conversations away from herself. The issue isn't privacy. Everyone deserves personal space. The difference is emotional openness. When someone stops sharing naturally, it may mean a part of their internal world is no longer being brought into the relationship. A wise man understands that distance often begins in communication long before it appears anywhere else. Couples who once shared stories throughout the day may suddenly only talk about logistics, bills, schedules, responsibilities. The emotional layer disappears, while the practical side remains. It still works, but it no longer feels connected. And when communication becomes selective, another shift often starts appearing quietly in the background, one that can be seen not through words, but through changes in appearance and habits. Topic 6. Her appearance changes in a noticeable way. A change in appearance isn't automatically a red flag. People evolve, reinvent themselves, and sometimes just want to feel better about how they look. A new hairstyle, different clothes, or renewed confidence can be part of healthy self-growth. The key isn't the change itself, it's the timing, intensity, and context behind it. When appearance shifts happen suddenly and without a clear reason, they naturally draw attention, especially when they seem tied to a new energy or hidden motivation. A man may notice she starts dressing differently for situations that never required extra effort before. Maybe she wears perfume more often, spends longer getting ready, or suddenly becomes highly invested in her appearance during specific moments of the day. None of these details prove anything on their own, but human behavior rarely changes in isolation. When appearance upgrades happen alongside emotional distance, routine shifts, and increased privacy, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Wise observation comes from connecting behavior instead of reacting emotionally. Self-improvement usually comes with openness. People proudly talk about new habits, fitness goals, or style changes. Hidden motivation feels different. It often arrives with vague explanations or subtle secrecy. A man who pays attention notices not only what changed, but when it changed, and how she behaves around it. And once appearance begins reflecting an internal shift, another clue often appears through something even harder to control: emotional reactions under pressure. Topic 7. She reacts defensively to innocent questions. One of the clearest behavior changes doesn't happen during major arguments. It happens during simple conversations. A harmless question that once received a calm answer suddenly creates tension. A man asks where she went, who she was with, or why something changed, and instead of openness, he gets irritation, defensiveness, or unexpected hostility. The question itself may be normal, but the reaction feels unusually intense. That emotional mismatch is often what makes the moment difficult to ignore. Defensiveness rarely comes out of nowhere. People become guarded when they feel exposed, misunderstood, or afraid of what a conversation might uncover. A woman who once answered naturally may start responding with questions of her own. Why are you asking that? Or don't you trust me? The focus shifts away from the original topic and lands on his curiosity instead. That creates confusion because the man often feels like he didn't do anything wrong, simply noticed something different and wanted clarity. A wise man pays attention to emotional intensity. The biggest clue isn't always the answer, it's how much emotion surrounds a simple interaction. For example, when casual questions suddenly trigger frustration, avoidance, or blame, it may point to internal discomfort. People often react strongly when a subject touches something they're trying to protect, and once communication becomes defensive, another shift often follows in a place that feels even more personal: intimacy and physical connection. Topic 8. Her intimacy feels different or inconsistent. Intimacy is one of the few parts of a relationship where words matter less than energy. A man can often feel when something changes, even if he can't explain it right away. The connection may still exist physically, but emotionally, it feels different, less natural, less present, almost rehearsed. Many men ignore this instinct because they assume intimacy should stay predictable over time. But intimacy is deeply tied to emotional alignment, and when that alignment changes, the body often reveals it before words ever do. Sometimes the difference shows up as distance. She may avoid physical closeness, become less affectionate during private moments, or seem mentally absent even while being physically there. Other times, the change comes through inconsistency. One week she feels deeply connected, the next she becomes detached without explanation. This emotional back and forth creates confusion because it doesn't follow a clear pattern. A man starts wondering whether he's imagining things or simply overthinking. But repeated inconsistency usually points to something deeper than temporary moods. Wise men understand that intimacy rarely exists in isolation. When emotional openness fades, physical connection often becomes mechanical instead of genuine. The gestures remain, but the emotional depth feels thinner. It's like hearing a familiar song that somehow sounds different, even though the melody hasn't changed. And when intimacy begins losing its natural rhythm, many men start relying on something harder to explain, but impossible to ignore: intuition.
Your intuition.
Keeps noticing small inconsistencies. Most men are taught to ignore intuition because they don't want to seem insecure, jealous, or overly suspicious. They convince themselves they're overthinking. They search for logical explanations and assume every strange feeling must have an innocent reason. But intuition rarely shows up as panic. It usually arrives quietly through repeated inconsistencies that don't fully make sense. a forgotten detail, a story that changes slightly, a reaction that feels out of place. On their own, these moments seem small. Together, they begin forming a pattern. A man's intuition often comes less from emotion and more from observation. The brain naturally tracks behavior, tone, habits, and routine without conscious effort. When something no longer lines up, discomfort appears. For example, she says she was too tired to go out, but suddenly has energy for plans that don't include him. Or her explanation about a situation changes depending on when he asks. These aren't dramatic discoveries. They're subtle contradictions that create internal tension because they challenge what once felt stable. Wise men understand that intuition should never be confused with paranoia. The goal isn't to accuse, chase, or assume the worst. Real power comes from calmly observing repeated patterns over time. Intuition becomes valuable when it's backed by consistency instead of fear. Many men ignore their instincts because they hope reality will prove them wrong. But sometimes, the quiet feeling they tried to dismiss wasn't insecurity at all. It was awareness picking up on what words hadn't yet confirmed. Conclusion. At the end of the day, the goal isn't to live in suspicion, it's to live with awareness. Strong men don't ignore patterns, and they don't betray their own instincts, just to avoid uncomfortable truths. Every relationship leaves clues through behavior, energy, communication, and consistency. The real question isn't whether signs exist. The real question is whether a man is willing to see them clearly. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept isn't what changed in her. It's realizing how long he ignored what was right in front of him. Take a second and ask yourself, have you ever felt like something was off, but talked yourself out of trusting your own instincts? Have you ever looked back and realized the signs were there the entire time? Awareness isn't weakness. It's protection. It's emotional intelligence. And the men who learn to observe without panic are often the ones who avoid the deepest regrets. Understanding behavior isn't about control. It's about seeing reality before reality forces itself into your life. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't keep that knowledge to yourself. Use it. Reflect on it. Start paying attention to patterns instead of excuses. And tell us in the comments, which sign do you think men ignore the most? Your experience might help another man recognize something he's been overlooking. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning the psychology behind attraction, relationships, and human behavior. This is where men sharpen awareness, one truth at a time.